Hello, this is Mark Lieberman, the host of The World According to Mark, brought to you through WPVMLP in Asheville, North Carolina, 103.7 on your dial, and streaming globally on WPVMFM.org. My guest today is a professor at Florida Atlantic University, and she has a lot of other background and experience, which we'll get into. But I first want to thank Palina Prysmakova for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
Palina, you were on the show back in April of 2021, and we were talking primarily about Belarus, which is your native country. And we talked about what happened in 2020 in Belarus. And we want to talk a little bit more about that, or talk about that again today, just to bring our listeners who didn't have the luxury of listening to that to find out again more about Belarus. But we're talking again today also because the things that are happening in Ukraine, the Russian invasion and the efforts of Ukraine to repel the Russian invasion bring up a lot of issues that I think you would say are reminiscent or similar, with some key distinctions. And I thought your insight would be very, very valuable. So again, thank you for being on the show. And again, I want to talk a little bit, or have you introduce a little bit about how you got to Florida Atlantic University. You're an associate professor in the School of Public Administration. I'm looking to my side here. You also have a title of Secretary of The Rada, which I think I'm pronouncing correct, which is the government in exile of Belarus. But why don't you tell us about how you got to Florida Atlantic University, and also your affiliation with another institute called the Public Justice and Human Rights Program, I guess would be correct.
Yeah, it's Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Center, which is a center across the university. Yeah, thank you, Mark, again for inviting me this time around. Yeah, briefly, how I end up being a Florida Atlantic. I am the citizen of Belarus, and I got my PhD in Miami, Florida International University, related to public affairs, and all my research have been on my home country in Belarus, and I'm patiently waiting for opportunity to go back and work at home. Unfortunately, this has been stretched long in time. So meanwhile, I'm working, proudly working at Florida Atlantic University in the public administration program. And as you probably mentioned, I also affiliate since recently of Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Center, which has a lot of research and public relations related activities with human rights and injustice in the United States, but also abroad.
Okay. So I thought it might be useful just to give a brief history lesson of the country of Belarus, which many people may not know very much about. It's not a large country, but it's not a small country either. It has 9.3 million people, and possibly more from the time that census was taken. It occupies about 80,000 square miles, and it's actually considered to be the 13th largest and 20th most populous country in Europe. So it's not a small country, but it has gone through a very tumultuous, I guess is the word, history, going way back even before the Soviet Union, and possibly even back before Russia was clearly Russia. So can you take us through a little bit of history leading up to the current state of affairs in that country?
Right. It was one of the policies starting from Russian Empire to USSR. So what's going on right now is actually to hide our country very well from all of you people from outside. So it's a strong influence of Russia indeed. But we've been an independent, separate country for centuries. We have been baptized by Icelandic missionaries that get the permission from Constantinople to bring Christianity to our land. So we had a lot of context in traditional, historical, and governmental contacts with Scandinavia. We had our king elected or invited from Scandinavia to rule our lands at some point in the history. So, but indeed, for people from the West, we've been often associated either with a part of Russia or with a part of Polish, who are kind of rebellious and don't want to become Catholic, because traditionally, as explained, the way they brought the Christianity, we've been Protestants. Of course, whoever was occupying us at different times was trying to make us Catholics, was trying to make us Orthodox. So, and here's how we kind of disappearing from the maps, because people from outside always want to adjoin us to something else. Yeah, so that's the brief history as much as I can, but it's a big country for European size. You could think about something like Switzerland in terms of population. The nature is very, very similar. The only difference, we do not have mountains, but all the rest, the vegetation, lakes, the way of life is rather similar. But the difference is the level of income, definitely.
Okay, so for geopolitical purposes, I guess it's worth mentioning that Russia, Belarus is landlocked, meaning it doesn't have an ocean, unlike Ukraine. You have Russia breathing down its neck to the east and the northeast, Ukraine in the south, Poland in the west, and Lithuania and Latvia to the northwest. So as you were suggesting, because of its position, which is sort of a land bridge, that is borders on or cuts across various countries, it's been the subject of military invasion, occupation. Various people in various countries and various groups have, trampled all over it, trying to establish, some degree of permanence. And then if I just sort of jump, again, if I've said something wrong, please correct me, but if I jump quickly to the establishment of the Soviet Union, even prior to the Soviet Union, we had the Russian Revolution in 1917, and there obviously Belarus was ultimately part of that Russian Empire, although
that was not. That was
not.
The thing.
Not okay. Yeah. It was not.
Originally,
okay.
it was not. Yeah, originally it was not. But people were welcoming this movement because they finally were hoping that there would be the end of Russian Empire with a Tsar on top of them. So the lines of promise that were coming from Lenin was actually that there's going to be a union of independent states, and that Belarus will be an equal participant in the union, which of course otherwise soon after turned out into the classic Moscow rules with all a scenario, and Belarusian government had to live in exile to exist, right? Yeah.
Right, and thank you for correcting me, but I guess just before that, there was the Polish-Soviet War, in which almost half of Belarus's territory was ceded to Poland. Is that okay?
Correct, yeah.
So modern Belarus, I think, came into being around 1939, around the time of World War II. Is that more or less?
I would go back to the Soviet Revolution. That's the one we happened. The Belarusian Democratic Republic was announced soon after the revolution. So the rest was, again, dividing and trying to establish the rule over either Polish or Soviets, making deals with Polish and so on. So it is at least 2 decades before the Second World War. Yeah.
Okay. In as early as 1945, Belarus SSR, which I guess you'll explain what that means, became a founding member of the United Nations along with the Soviet Union. And then by 1990, the Republic proclaimed its sovereignty. So again, help us get through that so we can get up to sort of modern day.
Yeah, I guess it also explains a lot what's going on right now in Belarus and Russia relationship. So as much as Russia always had an ambition, and again, maybe we should say the rulers of Russia, not to generalize with people, because it's not the same. We know that a lot of people that understand what's going on exist in Russia as well. When Russian rulers were trying to establish their power over territory of Belarus, they also would understood, as much as I think they understand today, that having a puppet ally makes more sense for international law than have an occupied territory. Because Belarus is a Soviet country, but it is independent or is free within the Union. It has its vote in the United Nations, right? It has its power in the United Nations. You properly mentioned we're one of those who started the United Nations. We're one of those who signed the Genocide Convention as a separate member, and so on and so on. So that's been always the tricky part, is how much rulers in Moscow, St. Petersburg would like us to be fully part or just best friends forever, right?
So again, to my sense of what you're saying, just to further explain, Belarus has proclaimed itself and continues to operate as if it is independent, but with the installation of a very controversial figure, Alexander Lukashenko, is not really acting in any way, shape, or form as a democracy. It is an authoritarian government that takes a lot of instructions and orders from Russia, not the Soviet Union, but Russia. And it sort of operates in kind of a quasi-satellite position, even though, quote, the Soviet Union, fell supposedly, but Russia still exercises domination through this partnership and the installation of Alexander Lukashenko. Would you agree with that?
To a certain extent, I think what you're describing is what has been happening during the past several years after the fake elections of 2020. Right before that, we actually had some sort of a spring, if I might say, because there were more and more relations established with West that were trying to democratize us in a softer way, doing more business with us. At some point, actually, the main trade partner was the Netherlands with our country, not Russia, even though Russia, of course, would occupy the large portion of our budget. But so that was sort of an idea, like Alexander Lukashenko, who is the current junta leader of the country, with all the military supporting him. He has his ego of being the czar of his own piece of land, right? So by no means he is a guy who was sent by Putin, but of course, in the situation he ended up in right now, when his own population, and it was confirmed by the mass protests in 2020, when there were hundreds of thousands of people on the street saying, that's the end, we don't want this president anymore, because this president, the first president since 1994, right? So this person never moved out of the office. And even though before, let's say, he was supported by some sort of passive population saying, oh, okay, but we're not interested in politics. Yeah, something is very wrong going on there, but we don't want to get into that. Like in 2020, people understood that it's time to get involved. And that's when Lukashenko became even more dependent on Russia and to stay in power, which he's staying right now, only using the force.
Okay, so something that you said, Palina, I think is instructive about Ukraine, which is Alexander Lukashenko came into power after a brief period in which Belarus was being courted, shall we say, by Western countries, and you mentioned one in particular, but they were trying to develop cordial economic relationships, at least with the West. And is it fair to say that that was considered to be threatening to Russia, and therefore they inserted their finger or their fist into the politics, which led ultimately to Lukashenko being installed? And even though it still considers itself, the government still considers itself independent, has fallen in line for the most part with Russia's foreign politics are and even some of its domestic politics. Does that ring true in any sense?
Yeah, but the way I see it is that actually in the 90s, there would be, I think, even more Americans who would know where Belarus is. Because after the fall of the Soviet Union, we end up having a lot of nuclear weapons on our territory, right? The same happened to Ukraine. And what happened actually in the 90s, when the Soviet Union decided to fall apart, which actually happened in Belarusian forest, which is in Belarus, where they signed the papers to dissolve the Soviet Union, we end up having all the nuclear weapons, same Ukrainians, but the button to operate them ended up being in Moscow. So basically, we had the nuclear weapons without any ability to control them. And of course, it was very dangerous for the entire planet. So all eyes were on us and on our region, and especially for Americans. And there was a lot of programs that include the American government to help us stop being a nuclear power country and a nuclear weapon country. And the same with Ukraine. And we end up having a lot of international treaties signed up that would claim our neutrality, because we said, okay, we can give in all these nuclear weapons. We don't know what to do with them, but we want to have some protection of the West, knowing that now that we don't have this on our territory, nobody's going to come and occupy us.
So let me ask you, just to be clear, are you saying that there were nuclear weapons in Belarus, but there now are not, and that as part of an effort to try to court and be accepted by the West, that Belarus gave them up and they're no longer sitting in Belarus?
Absolutely. It was, yeah. It
Okay.
was the, let me say it in correct English, I'll just double check. And it was called the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances.
Okay.
And there were people who signed it, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and they signed a treaty of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And the memorandum was originally signed by 3 nuclear powers, by Russian Federation, United Kingdom, and United States. And it was actually with the help of Americans that these nuclear weapons were removed from our country and happily resold to Russia, but this is another story. But we became a neutral country, and in our constitution in the 90s, it clearly says that we're a neutral country, that we're not west to east, we live ourselves, and we try to get the non-conflict whatsoever.
Okay.
And look what happened literally 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, with all the pressure of Putin as well. We had the famous fake referendum that took place in our country in Belarus, literally a couple of weeks ago, again, forced by Putin, that we just changed our constitution. I mean, they changed constitution saying that we're not neutral party anymore.
Okay. So they're saying you're not neutral, which means in effect that Russia's saying that you're aligned with Russia. But the other point that you're making that I think our listeners would like to hear you say is more clear than I have been able to say it, is you gave up the missiles much in the same way as Ukraine gave up the missiles in exchange for a hopeful, respected neutrality, and which would hopefully make you safe from either side. But now I'm guessing it's unclear whether or not Belarus made the wrong choice. Some Ukrainians are saying we should never have given up our missiles, because had we kept them, we might have been able to deter Putin from being so aggressive and threatening the the Russian arsenal of nuclear weapons. Now that's a mouthful. Can you weigh in on what I just said? But before you answer, let me give you a second to collect your thoughts. I am talking with Palina Prysmakova, who is the associate professor at the School of Public Administration at Florida Atlantic University. And we're talking about some of the history of Belarus, which resonates with some of the history of Ukraine. And we're seeing played out in real time, so to speak, some things that Belarus had anticipated, or some people in Belarus had anticipated, and which has got to create sort of a nightmare scenario for you. So in any event, back to the question, if you want me to repeat it, I'll try to remember exactly what I asked you. But it has to do with the give up of the nuclear missiles.
Absolutely, yeah. So the give up of nuclear missiles in the 90s, we see the consequences of today. That's the result. So something, again, those who have not been following the world politics, have not been following Eastern European politics, because there's a lot of other hot places in the world, and I completely understand them. But right now, especially with the nuclear threat that Putin and his junta try to proclaim, right, or popularize, and the panic they try to create, it all roots back in the 90s in this, what is called Budapest Memorandum, when we were forced and welcomed by both the United States and Russia to give up our power to self-defend, let's say, or to give up our voice, because even if we don't know how to operate, but having this stuff on our territories, on our land, will make world leaders ask our opinion, correct? And as soon as, and we had the Clinton coming to Belarus, and a lot of things were going on. Why the population itself, let's say, is compared to Ukraine, but why the population in Belarus itself were very actually happy to get rid of the nuclear weapons was the Chernobyl. It happened literally 5, 6, 7 years before of signing this memorandum. So Chernobyl physically is located in Ukraine, but it's close enough to the border. And when the explosion of the reactor happened, all the nuclear pollution with the rain ended up on Belarus mostly. So we still have a territory, a large portion of territory actually where the troops are in now, that has been closed territory. People were moved out from their inhabitants and so on, because it still has a very high level of pollution. We're talking about 30 years later. So people having relatives, friends, and so on, suffering from a lot of cancer, child cancer on a huge scale, right? All of a sudden in the country, they were very scared of having anything else that has to be with nuclear.
Losing
right?
you for a
Whether
second. See if we can get your sound back. Okay,
Do you have me now?
go ahead. Yeah.
Do you have me now?
Something's amiss.
Do you have me now? No?
We're experiencing a technical difficulty. Can
right.
you hear me?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. You were talking about the loss of nuclear weapons. And then you were talking about the fact that Belarus, much of the population were okay with giving it up because you saw the toxic effects of a reactor, which is for peaceful purposes, but a reactor that exploded because it was not properly maintained, possibly not properly built. So if you can hear me, I would like you to ask you this question. Does Belarus presently have any nuclear reactors that is actually in its territory for power purposes?
Do you hear me now?
I do.
All right, great. That's an excellent question. Actually, with the help of Rosatom, which is Russian Atomic Society Corporation, you name it, we got, against all the will of Belarusian population, a nuclear power station built just recently on the border with Lithuania. So it's physically on the territory of Belarus. And it has not launched until the fake elections in 2020. So it has not been operated. It has been built by Russian Federation agents, but has not been in operation. And as soon as Lukashenko confirmed his 6th term, he launched the station. And as we know, it's dangerous. And the most important danger, let's say, even if there's no war and everything's nice and peaceful, is that he himself and us being a landlocked small country in the middle of Europe, we have nowhere to do with the nuclear waste.
Nowhere to put it.
We're not a luxury of Russia that we can have somewhere, Kamchatka, Yakutsk, whatever, somewhere in the middle of the world to put a container somewhere and bury it, or I don't know how Swiss doing it somewhere deep in the mountains. We have nowhere to dispose, and the nuclear station is producing a nuclear waste every second and operates. And so far, it was even some threats from the president saying when there's a lot of sanctions recently imposed on Belarus, but there was even moments when the president was saying that he can use it against people who put sanctions on him, which we call a dirty nuclear weapon because it's not really a weapon, right? But it's still a nuclear waste. And knowing this guys in power, this people in power, they can do whatever they would like, having the nuclear waste in their hands. And we're talking about the country physically located in the middle of Europe.
Right. So Belarus is not exactly in an ideal space, both politically, as you're in discussing, geographically. It's right in the thick of things. And now, Belarus obviously is not affiliated with NATO, but there are neighboring countries that are. But I guess I want to make clear again to the audience that when you say fake election, you're speaking in part of your own opinion. The government in exile presumably believes that as well. But I think you're also saying that a large part of the Belarus population believes that, and yet you're in effect stuck with this leader who presumably, was he not popularly elected? Was it a, quote, rigged election? And how, and what is his term? Is he someone who can stay in power perpetually, it would appear, just like Putin thinks he can stay in power perpetually?
It's not my opinion, it's a fact, and the fact for several reasons. I myself was personally back home going to election poll, and there was a big campaign which actually IT technologies allow us to do this time around, which has not been possible before in previous rounds. Most of the people are already equipped with the cell phones, with the smartphones. They've been taking pictures of their own ballots and uploading them in the cloud afterwards, and we have a database of millions of votes showing whom people gave their vote to. So it's not even an idea or guessing. I mean, this is a fact, because this fact cannot be given, or any confirmation cannot be given by the central election authority in Belarus, but us regular people have access to the database of all the election ballots of people who voted alternatively. So there's no doubt about that the president was not elected by majority of the population. There's no question about that. But I think the second part was about. Well,
let me ask you a follow up on that. Is there a new election in the offing? Is one supposed to occur at some point so that there's a possibility that a more popularly elected leader could come up, or perhaps even the installation of the government in exile? Or is that not something that you see as on the horizon?
Again, well, just 3 weeks ago, we got a new constitution imposed on the population of Belarus, and it's still not exactly clear how it's going to function, but apparently this constitution removes some powers from the president and gives it to some newly body that we still have to create, some national sort of assembly, new type, because we already have a national assembly, but the president becomes like a head of this national assembly till forever. So it's very complicated, but the idea is that even though this person claims to be in his sixth term already, but with a new constitution, he can be another 15 years in power. It doesn't matter of changing the titles or changing the name of the cabinet.
So for all intents and purposes, you have a dictator in power, not popularly elected, came into power as a result of a, quote, rigged election, to use terms that have been bandied about in this country. And it's in a precarious situation. And just to give a little extra information about the precariousness of it, again, I want to talk a little bit about the reaction or what's been talked about as far as the Belarusian response to the conflict in Ukraine. But let me again announce to my listeners that we're speaking to Professor Palina Prysmakova, who is the Associate Professor at the School of Public Administration at Florida Atlantic University. And we're talking about her deep understanding of the situation in Belarus, the unfortunate situation. And now I'd like to direct a couple of questions to you regarding the conflict. First of all, there was news, whether it's true, false, or whatever, that Belarus as a country had come out in support of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And while I think where sanctions are already in place against Lukashenko and the country of Belarus, that created an opportunity for new sanctions, both by the EU and possibly by the United States, but imposing more pressure, but probably more pain on the population of Belarus. Can you explain that a little bit more clearly than I just quickly went over it?
Right. So I just want to, again, give a little background on the current situation, because we call the person dictator. I, as being a scientist, professor of public administration, we try to use more neutral definitions of different positions and call it more like centralized power and so on and so on. So that anybody can make their own opinion of how would they call a ruler like this. But as for now, since the last elections, which he claimed he won with 60-70+% of vote, we have more than 10 people killed who are trying to protest. We have more than 40,000 arrests. 40,000 arrests. We're talking about 8 million country, right? 9 million country. We have, as for now, 1,300 people serving political sentences, political charges in prison. 1,300. We have 33 imprisoned journalists. We have politically motivated charges in protest, 5,000 charges, and more than 5,000 reports of torture. Because it's not only the political catch-up that people who are protesting, there's physical torture reports, also from sexual assaults to not giving food and water. So we're talking about so you can call it whatever terminology you like or the listeners would like, but that's the current junta regime occupying the country. So whenever, and that's my role here also, being the Secretary of Rada, to explain and to ask, please ask everybody who is listening to us right now, not to say Belarus, not to say Russia, but to say Putin and to say Lukashenko, because this is what we're seeing right now going on in Ukraine. It is not a nation against nation war. It's not a Belarusian nation supporting a Russian nation in the invasion of Ukraine, God forbid. It is a Putin invasion of Ukraine in cooperation with Lukashenko junta, who holds the territory. The only difference, because of the misfortunate situation of Lukashenko losing his power, losing his popular support, the tanks that are currently in Belarus were just rolled in.
From Russia.
Yes, so Ukraine resists, but we got occupied just before. And that's what again, going back to this fake referendum that took place, which is proper word is a plebiscite, because in not free countries, there is no way to do any referendums, right? It's a plebiscite. The people were made to elect something or choose something, but the choice was already known, right? So they made this referendum when they removed the word of being military neutral, allowed Belarus or Lukashenko to proclaim Belarus part of this conflict, but it's not Belarusian people who are interested in this conflict. We have mass protests against it. Those people who still can protest, because again, I just announced the numbers of people being in prison or being politically charged. So I would like just to ask everybody, call those responsible by their names, not hiding by the big titles of, oh, Belarus, oh, Russia, and so on. Let's just be focused on those who are guilty and call them their full names.
Okay, fair point. So we don't have to resort to terms like autocrat or dictator. What you're saying is it's not the people per se, it's the leadership. But of course, the leadership, the junta, as you refer to it, in Belarus, obviously also has control of the military. And now it may be the case that the involvement in the Ukraine invasion, so to speak, is not being directed by anybody in particular in Belarus, or it could be that Lukashenko still has power over a Belarusian military, and maybe Belarus, maybe he's willing to commit troops, or maybe he has already to the invasion of Ukraine. What's your understanding of that?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. Of course, according to the legal documents we have, which again, there is, as Lukashenko as a side of him, it's too difficult to apply rules right now. So, so legally, he is the commander-in-chief, right? So he is the main military person in the country, and all the military should obey his orders. He used this to suppress the protest within the country. So no matter how much the military was resisting, but it's known fact that a lot of army people were forced to participate in internal domestic war against their own people. And as we know, most of them did not like it because that's not the purpose of the army. Army is here to protect its people from outside threats, not to suppress them within the country. But having said that, so let's say the support or not support of the army and Lukashenko has been already in a question for what, good 2 years, right? And a lot of people got fired, and a lot of people got resigned themselves because they did not want to be part of the junta orders and take responsibility for that. But definitely, there's still a lot of people in the army. And also, what needs to be understood, we still have this mandatory military service for all the males. So we have a lot of young boys on a military basis right now just doing their service. So of course, whenever the war in Ukraine started, that was the main concern of again, those people who, let's say, are less concerned about politics, just trying to find their sons, start calling the military bases, asking, is my boy sent to the war? So far, the official wording is that Belarus is not sending the soldiers, neither those on duty, but also those who are on the contract, right, to Russia. But also there's a lot of discussion going on that knowing the losses of the Russian army and their urgent need in more people, that it's highly possible that the Belarusian recruiters would be dressed up in the Russian military uniform to be sent to the war.
So I know that you're not exactly in touch with the intelligence operations around the world, but you're saying your understanding is that military conscripts, people in Belarus, could be forced into a situation where they're fighting on behalf of Russians and in favor or in support of the invasion. But to your knowledge, that hasn't occurred yet, but that doesn't mean it couldn't occur. Is that what you're saying?
Officially, it has not, yes. But also, I would like to say the other way around things occurred. We have divisions of Belarusian volunteers who are fighting in Ukraine, and they've been fighting also with the war Donetsk and Lugansk. So again, for those people who were just happened a couple of weeks ago, Belarusian population and Belarusian men have been involved in this war on the side of Ukraine already for sooner decades, right? So just
as we've heard that members that citizens of Poland have signed up, and from other countries they've sent contingents to come in support of the Ukrainians. That's what you're saying, correct?
Even more. Sorry, that's what you're saying is right now to respond to the current attack. But when I'm saying that the Belarusian people who are volunteering, Belarusian men who've been volunteering to fight on the side of Ukrainians have been present even during the war in Donetsk and Lugansk.
Okay, the war that broke out earlier. I got you. I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've indicated quite clearly that, again, you've got a situation where you have an illegitimate, shall we say, leader of Belarus, but you have a population that's diverse, with a substantial portion of the Belarusian population against what Russia has done, is doing, might do. Is there, and you've also indicated that people that have been in a position of speaking out or telling the truth, such as journalists, are subject to torture, to death, censorship, imprisonment, things of that nature. So with that level of draconian measures being employed, is there still anything resembling mass protests? has there been mass protests since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in Belarus, with Belarusians vocally supporting the Ukrainians and vocally opposing the Russian invasion?
To a certain extent, as much as they can do in a military occupied territory with the Russian tanks under your window, right? So of course, we cannot expect people having the protests of the scale they've been in 2020. It's not safe to be on the street, not talking about providing your opinion, right? But of course, there were people, especially a lot of people use this situation of fake referendum, this plebiscite, to actually group together to express their opinion, and so on and so on. Of course, there is actions of solidarity going on, especially more abroad right now, because besides all this million of Ukrainians that are immigrating right now on humanitarian asylum-seeking purpose, fleeing the country, same but on a small extent happened to Belarusian, just because we're a small country, and of course we did not have that level of terror before. So there is a lot going on outside of the country right now, but also, which is very unfortunate, and it should not, again, it's in our hands to change it. There has been more and more reports of Belarusians being attacked abroad because the general population does not understand what's going on, and they equalize Belarusians with Russians.
When you say Belarus has been attacked abroad, yeah, you mean by the imposition of sanctions or other measures?
Physical aggression. Let's say some Polish population, some Polish people would see a Belarusian car on the Belarusian plates, and they will attack the car, because for them, again, people who have not been in the world of politics don't understand the complexity behind that. And all the media saying, oh, Belarus participates with Russian invasion of Ukraine. People do not go into detail. And it's our work here, our mission, to explain it's not Belarus, it's Lukashenko, it's not Russia, it's Putin, because the general aggression of the population outside, for whom the conflict is a newborn thing, is just happen thing. They've not been following for the last 10 years. They equalize everybody in the same story. The Ukrainians and the rest of Russians right now in the world, not understanding that those Belarusians who are outside, that's why they're outside, because they had to flee on the same reason why the Russian tanks came into our country, but the difference, we were not able to resist to the extent the Ukrainians can.
I see. So in effect, the Belarusians are getting attacked from both ends, so to speak. It's not, and that one can conclude is either the purpose or the effect when seeds of lies, misinformation, distortions are afoot. Then and you have a precious lack of free speech and independent journalists, that's the sort of thing that results. You have people coming to conclusions based upon, I don't like to use the word fake news, but based upon deliberate misinformation, lies, and distortions. And that's the situation that you say many Belarusians are exposed to, even those that are not residing in Belarus. If they're residing in Poland, where the Polish government, I guess, is showing active support for the Ukrainians, but that doesn't help a poor Belarusian who's happens to be over there, who's called out as being a supporter of the Russian invasion, even when that person is not. That's the point you're trying to make, correct?
Even when the entire nation is not, yes. So it's not the person versus the country, it's the person who is called Lukashenko versus the country. And we're not talking about the Belarus, where there is no media whatsoever left at this moment, no NGO left at this moment. We're talking about actually the world who has freedom of speech. That's what I'm talking to about. That's what I'm calling on. Those people who have the freedom of speech, this nation who have the freedom of speech, to be a little bit deeper in the conflict. They understand that there's a situation created by several people who got in power and as against of, I don't know, even if I may, I'm not specialist in wars and comparative analysis of this scale, but it's compared to the world of the Second World War, when there were nations upset with nations for some measures, right? So maybe that is where it leads, but at a particular moment, we need to be very clearly holding this line here in the Western hemisphere, right? In what they call world of North, so that there is Belarus, there is Lukashenko, there is Russia, and there is Putin. And how many people in Russia who don't even speak Russian? And they also right now all equalize to one thing, to be one all the same thing that attacks Ukraine. And it's not correct.
Okay. So I want to ask you another question then. What you're indicating, among other things, is there are parallels in some respects about what's going on in Ukraine now and what has gone on in Belarus since the installation of Lukashenko. But one could argue that that Russia achieved what it was looking for in Belarus without having to start a war, without having to roll tanks in, without having to send troops in, without having to shell cities and missiles and all of that, because it was more, I won't say that this is necessarily accurate, but almost like a bloodless coup, so to speak. Whereas in Ukraine, because of the resistance that Ukraine has had and maybe the support from other countries around the world, even though they have not actually engaged in troops on the ground, or boots on the ground, I guess is the phrase. What's happening in Ukraine is different, very different from what happened in Belarus, but maybe for the same ultimate objective. What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, these things we're making parallel. That's a very, very reasonable way and point here to actually look at the what you call leadership, which I would say rulership, especially in case of Belarus. So please understand that Lukashenko and Putin, they're not best friends. They hate each other, and they've been disturbing each other, and they've been doing things that each other don't like for long extended period of time. They just have to be on the same sort of side at this particular moment. And that'll be the difference between Belarus and Ukraine, that Ukraine, no matter what's going on in the country, I'm looking at corruption level, but they have a president that people elected. Whether they're happy about this president, whether they're not happy about this president and all other presidents before, they have elected this person. And this person openly says and leads the nation against the aggressor. Whereas in Belarus, the person in charge, not supported by the population, claims a friendship with Russia.
But you're saying, despite the claiming of the friendship, the leader of the country and Putin are not close friends. They don't. They're friends from a distance, is what I'm hearing you say, which is pretty extraordinary.
Right. He's cornered. He's cornered because he lost. At least before, he had some sort of popular support, even if it was minority, but he had it. And now he's cornered. So his last resort to stay in power, I'm talking about Lukashenko right now, is to do what Putin wants at the moment, whether Lukashenko wants it or not. And we've been doing the military training, as they say, military exercises of Russian troops and Belarusian troops, like forever. Even more, they were all starting getting involved Serbian troops there, and we had a lot of military exercises, including Serbians together. It was a big brotherhood of Slavic nations, or what they call it. And here's respect and great thank you to the Serbian nation, who actually stopped any military training with Belarus as soon as the fake election in 2020. They withdrew from all the training and any military activity together, even let's call it practice, right, or exercise. But the Russian troops doing exercise on territory of Belarus became more frequent to the extent as soon as the referendum was over, we're not doing exercise anymore. We're just here to shoot Ukraine, right? So it was not like, okay, now we're not neutral. Okay, now we allow Russians to come. Russians were already in the country. We just changed the rhetoric, even to the last moment. And we Belarusians, and we also the people who are in the Rada of Belarusian Democratic Republic, we've been observing this accumulation of military power on the border of Ukraine and Belarusian side already, also not just from yesterday, right? It happened, and we've seen it, and it's coming, and it was just for us. Let's say it was a matter when they will start shooting, because
not how,
obvious.
Not if, rather, but when, and when
exactly.
And some people would say that Putin has planned this for years, and that he didn't do it well. I'm not sure if this is the reason, but while Trump was in power, because he didn't really have to, but he was biding his time, so to speak, and waiting for what he thought was the most opportune time to do this.
With all my respect for the American nation and American presidents, we definitely have enormous power in the world of politics and international way of order. But I think that actually the misunderstanding and arrangements with Lukashenko played more important role because Lukashenko has not been, again, they're not best friends. Putin wanted to remove Lukashenko, to put somebody more loyal, and the whole thing around the elections in Belarus and the protests and the time it took to suppress the protests, I think that's what has been holding Putin from actually achieving what he's doing today. Because if he would do all the same with all the military in the country right now, 2 years ago, when hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets, they would just move these tanks upside down. It took time to suppress Belarusian population, to let people immigrate, which immigrate on a large scale and keep on trying to flee the country, so that safely right now, only those are left in the country who are really gonna sit in the basements no matter what, so the tanks can roll in.
My guest again is Associate Professor Palina Prysmakova, who is a professor in the School of Public Administration at Florida Atlantic University, and also a secretary of the government in exile of Belarus. And we're talking about some of the same things that occurred in Belarus that we're now seeing played out in Ukraine, but there are some distinct differences. So many people are asking the question, how does, quote, this all end? And when they say that, I guess in some respects they're saying, how does it end in Ukraine? But what happens in Ukraine affects many other countries, including Belarus and as well as the West. But the question of how it ends, I guess, is again subject to a lot of uncertainty and speculation. But what could happen, I guess, one scenario is that at some point Ukraine is either gives up or Zelensky loses power, God forbid, loses his life, and Russia not wanting to be tied down on the ground with another Afghanistan or a long war might pull out, but only again if a more pro-Russian government can be installed. What's your thought about this, if you have an opinion about it?
I think if it would be, let's say, this discussion, and we had it like 10, 15 years ago, the prediction would be absolutely different from as of today. But from my understanding of situation, of my understanding, talking to people in Ukraine, talking to my relatives in Ukraine, talking to my relatives in Russia, because again, we have been very much and on purpose interconnected and interrelated with all these three countries by the Soviets, and these connections and family here, back and there, and so on, has not disappeared just because right now is the war. By the way, there's a big monument which is called Three Sisters on the crossing where the point where Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia border
intersect.
Yeah, intersect. So whatever differences in opinion in Ukraine, or their affiliation, or their respect, nostalgia about Russia people used to have, I think none of that is left anymore. So despite of trying to, at least on the words, liberate Ukraine from nationalists and give more power and freedom to those Russian-speaking, I don't know how to say, politically correct, pro-Russian population, after these people have been sitting in the bomb shelters, they united as never. And it's not the matter of which language you speak right now, right? It's not the matter of let's say their ethnical identity, but their national identity, which definitely became rather clear and stronger right now. So any alluring ideas that Putin can put somebody pro-Russian in power right now, I think we could have had this conversation, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. But at the moment, I think it's not possible. No matter what super liberal pro-Russian government.
So just because somebody's,
people will not take it.
Right. Just because somebody speaks Russian doesn't mean they're pro-Russian or pro-Russian takeover. So do you see this as a long, protracted slog where the Ukrainians will continue to have resistance? Or do you see, again, I know you're not a military specialist, or do you see that eventually Russia might figure out some way to not lose face completely and pull out and leave Ukraine as a sovereign nation? Do you see any hope for that?
Again, we would say Putin, not Russia, because
I'm
Russia
sorry.
is
I'm
not
sorry.
supporting
Putin. Yes.
Right. So again, I'm not a specialist, as you correctly mentioned, but I understand international law, and I have a background in international law and educational one. So what I see it, let's say, again, we're speculating here, as you said, nobody can predict the future, but the whole demand of Putin that Crimea belongs to Russia, that Donbass, Lugansk belongs to Russia. Before this invasion, the whole world would say, no, wait a second. But when we deal with the real war, with humanitarian catastrophe that is unrolling right now, if there will be any sort of reasonable negotiation, I think more people, I'm not talking about Ukraine, I'm talking from nation outside, will be prone to say, okay, let's Crimea be Russian and whatever other pieces, but the rest, at least we save the rest. Again, please don't quote me on this, but we're discussing here again, we try to run different scenarios. So this might have been one of the scenarios that Putin is pursuing, to make a big mess that nobody has a doubt anymore. Okay, these things does not belong to him, but at least we stop the humanitarian catastrophe. We stop the real war with civilians dying and stuff like this. So that might be one of the outcomes.
Do you have an opinion, personal or otherwise, about what the so-called West can do that it's not presently doing? What should be its place? Obviously, we've both heard the United States and the EU doesn't want to get directly involved because they don't want to start World War III. But one could argue that World War III has already started.
That's true. And then we're going back to the 90s, and we're going back to the Budapest Memorandum on security assurances. So if the West does not want to involve with Russia in any sort of military confrontation, why this memorandum has been signed for him? This memorandum is exactly stating that Russia and UK and the United States allow Belarus and Ukraine be neutral countries. And if now one of the parties violates this memorandum, why are not supposed to sit back? That's the whole question. So I'm not sure. Yeah, go ahead.
We just have less than a minute left, but I think you've now capped one of the most important points that people are missing. The United States could get involved without having to call upon NATO because of the Budapest resolutions. And there's plenty of precedent for it to do that. But practically, we don't know whether that's going to happen because of issues beyond both of our controls. But I think that's going to have to be the last word, Palina, unless you've got one more thing that you want to throw in, and then we'll sign off. But thanks, Palina Prysmakova, a professor at Florida Atlantic, for being on the show today.
You're very welcome.
We'll have you back again, and we'll see how this plays out. Thank you.
Thank you.